continuing the theme and linking the theme back to the problem of evil, on page 170, a scenario is given with regard to multiple societal pressures which may affect the choice a person makes in life. So what I mentioned in this regard, a person born to a mother who smokes crack cocaine and is then raised within an abusive environment, and society will be affected in many ways by his surroundings. However, those social pressures do not remove the free will of that person, even if he is influenced by many negative factors. If you study the 10 parameters of a legally responsible individual and apply them on a person with such a social background of psychological and spiritual suffering, it will become apparent that God has not tasked him with more than he can bear, as all the factors that affect a person in their life are taken into account by God. This is in reference to the religious obligations and judgment in the hereafter, not in reference to personal suffering and psychological issues on earth. It must also be taken into account that such a person is not punished for actions influenced by the environment to the degree that it affects their free will. Additionally, the person is rewarded for any suffering in the hereafter. How is a person rewarded for any suffering? There could, meaning a kafir who has suffered on the earth, not of his own doing, it can remove some of the punishment, meaning lighten the punishment. This remaining human free will, which remains despite society and other pressures, is what is responsible for belief and disbelief, good deeds and bad deeds. If the free will of a person is taken away totally, either through abuse or thought reform and psychological totalism, then such a person is not liable on the Day of Judgment to the same degree as a person who has their free will and choice functioning. This, of course, varies according to the level of spiritual and psychological abuse, which may paralyze the freedom of the will, which can be determined by God alone. This is precisely what is meant by God not tasking a soul more than what it can bear. So levels of taklif may differ, and depending on those levels of taklif, the punishment and reward may differ also. So with regard to human free will, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala offered al-amana, inna aradna al-amanata, upon whom? As-samawat wal-ard wal-jibal, meaning creation was offered al-amana. What was this al-amana? Al-amana was the taklif. They refused to take al-amana. Humankind took up the amana because humankind was in a state of zalum and jahul. In that state, humankind took up the free will because they were in need of the revelation, in the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they took this up, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا إِن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ. You have no free will unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants you a free will. Meaning that free will, that limited free will that we have, is what we exercise and in accordance with which we are rewarded and punished. So what I mentioned on page 172 is that before Arthur Schopenhauer wrote in German, which is translated as what man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. So what does he state? Man can do what he wills, meaning man exercises his free will, but he cannot will what he wills, meaning the will itself is granted and limited. But before Arthur Schopenhauer had stated that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had already declared in Al-Quranul Kareem, but you will not, meaning وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ, unless God wills, unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted you will. What does that mean? The negation of will from man is the negation of independent creating. We do not create our own actions. Allah creates the actions. While the affirmation of the will of God for man is the free will, relatively limited as it is, that creates within man that by which he undertakes his responsibility and on which, alongside the intellect, he will be questioned in the afterlife. So the intellect and the free will, this exercising of the free will is what a human being is questioned regarding. So when a person exercises the free will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates for that human being the action. Meaning, when I intend to pick up this glass and exercise my free will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates for me the means and facilitation, the asbab by which I can pick up the glass. I will be judged on exercising the free will. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who creates the action. If Allah does not create the action, I will be unable to carry out the action. So, on page 174, what I mentioned, firstly, just slightly above, I mentioned Al-Kirmani stated, the servant has a choice in his actions, but has no choice in his choice. Now, this was prior to Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer's description of the will is a noumenal property, was definitely referring to a pre-Kantian definition. As Schopenhauer had criticized Kant's use of the word noumenal. What Schopenhauer meant by noumenal was reality itself, independent of our sense perceptions, a single undifferentiated entity that we can learn about. He called this entity the will. But how I break this down is, lastly, the ability of the will is an attribute that God creates at the time when a person makes a resolve to carry out an action. Once the means and instruments of that intended action are available and sound, if the person intends to carry out good, God will create the ability to do good. While if the person intends to do bad, God will create the ability to do bad. By making the wrong choice, the human being is thus responsible for any evil actions he may carry out, thereby wasting the free will God has given him. It is important to note at this point that the endowment of free will is from God. Yet what the person does with the free will is his own doing. If he chooses to do wrong, the pleasure of God is not in that choice. Therefore, there is a distinction between the will of God and his pleasure, meaning iradatullah, qada of Allah, and also rida of Allah, over the action taken by his servants. Philosophers have been debating these issues from Hellenistic times, predating the Stoics, leaving some philosophers to lament the lack of progression made. This conundrum is known as the problem of free will, and there are so many positions on it as there are philosophical schools. Western philosophers would likely describe the Kalam position as compatibilism or soft determinism. So our position in Western philosophy most likely would be called compatibilism and soft determinism, which is what that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a will. We exercise the will, but when we exercise the will, the creation of the action is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, there is further elaboration found on page 173 with regard to that. But what I mentioned on section 4.13 is, what is the meaning of God willing? If we say insha'Allah, what does that mean? I respond to that by saying the will of God this is on page 175, is a reference to the creation of the means by which things are carried out and does not negate the free will of humans. It reflects the recognition by the one who utters it that God creates the means by which all actions are carried out, once the human resolve to carry out a particular action has been made. If Tom resolves to drive to Cornwall and said, God willing, I am going to drive to Cornwall, the will of God means that God creates for Tom the instruments by which he can reach Cornwall, starting from his means of transport and its working parts, the roads that lead to Cornwall, as well as his safety. The will of God does not negate the free will of Tom to make that choice of wanting to travel to Cornwall. This passage was partly inspired by during lockdown when one of the ministers drove down, I think, to Cornwall, breaking the lockdown rules. So I utilize this as an example. But it summarizes what do we mean when we say insha'Allah. When we say insha'Allah, by the will of Allah, it means Allah will create the means. The human being intends to carry out the action, has the resolve, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the actions. We will be punished and rewarded according to what resolve we make, and then what action we intend to carry out. Then what is the meaning when we say God guides whom He wills and misguides whom He wills? There are a few people who bring this up. Ayatul Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may mention with regard to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guiding and increasing in guidance, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala misguiding and increasing in misguidance. This would be that a person chooses not to listen or understand the truth and purposefully chooses misguidance. Then such a person, due to his choice, is further misguided, and the means of misguidance are compounded by his choice and arrogance. So ultimately, the human being is given a choice, but once he exercises that choice of misguidance, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increases his misguidance. This is how all the ayatul Quran with regard to that are understood. On section 4.15, we cover some of the reports, hadith, which ostensibly outwardly negate the free will. So there are a few examples of hadith. One of the hadith, famous hadith that many of us have memorized from the Arba'een of Al-Imam An-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, that a person does the actions of the people of paradise until between him and paradise there is nothing except an arm's length. So then the Qada and the Qadr, or Al-Kitab, overwhelms him, what has been preordained. And then he does the actions of the people of hell. Ostensibly, this negates free will, that the person was doing the actions of the people of paradise and then suddenly he is overwhelmed by that which has been preordained. So what I mentioned with regard to this is that the wording of the hadith, one of the narrations states فِيمَا يَبْدُ. فِيمَا يَبْدُ means in that which is apparent. That would mean the person does outward actions of the people of paradise outwardly, but inwardly he may have ostentation or even nifaq, and then toward the end of his life Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings out the outward actions of the people of hell. And outwardly a person may do the actions of the people of hell, but inwardly he is a believer and mu'min. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala toward the end of his life brings out the good actions. So this does not negate the exercising of the free will. Similarly, there is a second report, hadith mentioned here on page 178, which you can read yourself, but it covers that aspect which people may deem as being outwardly, it goes against the people exercising their free will, but on deeper reading of the hadith you will realize that the hadith, the sunnah, does not negate free will from people. From page 180, 4.16, I cover sin and free will, because the concept of sinning some people have is that there is no forgiveness. Because there are so many people who do not want to adopt Islam because of the outward actions, they do not realize that there is so much forgiveness in Islam, that if a person sins, his sin is not written down for 6 hours in case he does tawbah, and then if he does not do tawbah, the sin is erased by a good deed. And when he intends to do a good deed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the angels to write down one good deed. When he carries out the good deed, 10 good deeds are written down. And if he is from the people of ihsan, those are people who have no fard, meaning they fulfill all their fard, the good deed is increased to 700 good deeds. And then he will only lose one good deed for a bad deed. So this is the ultimate mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that sinners need to realize that when they turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is so much forgiveness. This section is mentioned so people realize that there is immense mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when people turn to Him. And of course, on page 182, I mentioned the outward people who do bad deeds but they have salvation, like the story of the prostitute and the dog. The Hadith states a prostitute had once been forgiven. She passed by a dog panting near a well. Thirst had nearly killed him. So she took off her sock, tied it to her veil, and drew up some water. Allah forgave her for that. And the story of a woman and the cat, which it mentions that there was a woman who she worshipped. She carried out acts of worship, but what happened? A cat which she had tied up, giving it neither food nor setting it free to eat from the creatures of the earth. And because of that, she was cast into hellfire because of that bad deed, even though outwardly she did good deeds. So based upon this, I mentioned the story of the Sufi sage and the Mongol chief. This was with regard to one of the awliyaullah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the Mongol chief, he said to him, the hair of your beard is equal to the fur of my dog. The Sufi sage, he responded by saying, you are correct. If I do not obey my master the way your dog obeys you, then the hair of my beard is worthless and of less value than the fur on your dog, meaning the master here being Allah. So that is why there is a section on the danger of religious arrogance, meaning what Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari rahimahullah ta'ala, he states, a sin that leads to humility is better than a virtue that leads to arrogance and hubris. So religious arrogance is one of the major sins, that people who ostensibly follow the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they fall into pride and arrogance. Then on page 184, I enter one of the main questions which Stephen Fry in his fallacy, when he states that a God demands that we stay on our knees forever. I have a section which is, why does God need our worship? Now note here the fallacy in the question, need. God actually does not need our worship. Allah is free from need, but Allah commands us to worship. But how this is answered is that I mentioned some atheists have framed this same objection differently by saying that God is a cosmic dictator or a heavenly Saddam Hussein. This is based on the conception that God must deal with people like the leader of a country should serve the people who elected him. So that's the fallacy of atheists. If he does not, then he is a dictator and has ill-served the people he governs. The analogy of God's justice to the leader of a nation or commonwealth is hopelessly flawed. How can one compare a human leader with the one who created humanity and established the heavens and the earth? The injustice witnessed in the world relates to the unjust people who violate the rights of others. Unjust because, for example, the people, their property and their rights, dignity and honor do not belong to a dictator. This is not the case with God, since everything belongs to Him and He does as He wills. In reality, that's sufficient as an answer, that everything belongs to God and He does as He wills. The fact that God can do what He wants is why some atheists despise the very concept of God and liken Him to a cosmic dictator, falling into the evident blunder of comparing a human dictator with the creator of everything who does what He wants with His creation. So I mentioned at that point that even if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cast everyone into hell, there would be no injustice on His part. What I mentioned further on page 185 is thus for created beings to demand that God treat them like a benevolent ruler is a fallacy, as God does what He wants. God has tasked His servants on earth with only that which they can bear, not overwhelming them with what they cannot do, judging them on their actions of choice from their intellect and free will, as well as all other conditions of a legally responsible person. God guides anyone who is sincere in the heart and wants guidance, and He misguides the one who is arrogant and rebellious. So this links up to the point on page 186 at the bottom paragraph, that God does not need our worship. He created us, thereby giving us the greatest of gifts, our own existence and life. So this is a common question people ask. Why did God create us? By creating us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon us a great favor. That favor is the favor of life and free will. A man indeed could spend his entire life without knowing about God or hearing His message and still enter eternal bliss in the afterlife, simply because God does not punish a person who has not heard the divine message. Yet those who have been gifted intellect, rational thought, ability and the time to investigate the message that reaches them, maturity, cognizance, and the right societal factors like not having their free will undermined by mental abuse and totalitarianism, such are those expected to submit and acknowledge their innate servitude to God. So here I mentioned the ayatul Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. With regard to that ayatul Quran, this is the meaning of what God says in the Quran: I created the jinn and humankind only that they might worship me. So people give citation to this. They say in Al-Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He only created humanity to worship Him. Some have translated the word worship as service, giving the impression to some that the meaning of this is hard acts of worship, rituals and rites. The correct meaning, however, is that man has been created to know God. This is why Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said that worship means to know Him. Knowing God means to recognize Him with the mind and heart by observing His signs. Attaining the means of recognizing Him is through worship, meaning the ibadah leads to ma'rifah. Worship leads to knowing Allah. Because worship is a constant means of recognizing God. That is referred to in the verse. Now, worship, ibadah, does not just mean rigorous acts of ibadah that people are familiar with. This is why toward the end of this page, I mentioned that science is ibadah. Science and studying science is an act of ibadah. This is based upon ayatul Quran. Many ayatul Quran like inna fi khalqi samawati wal ard to the end of the ayah, but also the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which I give citation to: the best of God's servants are those who observe the sun, crescent, moons and the stars as a way of remembering God. This I give reference to it, which would be in the Mustadrak of Imam al-Hakim rahimahullah ta'ala. And therefore, meaning that ibadah is not only limited to salah or sawm or these type of things, fasting and prayer. It also involves thinking, that a person of science could become a major arif billah, the one who knows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the purpose of human life is a segment on page 188, where the question is asked, why did God create us at all if He knew that some of us would go to hell? This is a common question. Why did God create people at all if He knew some of them will go to hell? Does this not contradict His being the most merciful and utterly good, as the premise of the above syllogism suggests, that He is morally perfect? The answer to this question, given the previous elaboration, would simply be that God is the doer of what He wills. That would be sufficient. Allah does what He wills. This objection, however, has an additional caveat, in that God, in creating people, knows many will disobey Him, and this would seem to contradict the attribute of being the most merciful. Further on, I elaborate in answering this objection with a thought experiment. But the questioner is asking that Allah is the most merciful. But if you remember, in the previous lesson, what was mentioned was that these people ignore the other attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In this case, we know Allah is ar-Rahman. His rahmah is with those whom He wills for the rahmah to extend to. Even though I mentioned that the rahmah even envelops the Ahlul Jahannam, the people of hell, in different ways. There are different manifestations of that rahmah. Ultimately, like you may have a homeless person roaming the streets. He's homeless. He is on drugs. Yet if you place him in a decent accommodation, he will be unable to live in that decent accommodation. There is still rahmah of Allah upon him while he is living on the roads. In the sense, he may not feel some of the affliction that he is suffering from. So there are different manifestations of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what I mention here, why would the divine action of God create beings who will ultimately disobey Him through their own free will, including the likes of Satan? Meaning, even though they are given these great gifts of free will and life, that alone would outweigh their disobedience. Would not this be the same as someone saying they have fidelity to their spouse and then commit adultery while still claiming fidelity? This was the counterclaim, an objection made by a former Muslim. He said, by you saying Allah is ar-Rahman, is this not like saying someone has fidelity to his wife and then commits adultery? Meaning, is it not a contradiction of the attribute of Allah? I respond to that by saying, the mistake this objector makes is not realizing that the manifestation of the names of God in Islam relates to the attribute of divine will. When God wills, He gives life, and when He wills, He takes life. And when He wills, He gives sustenance, and when He wills, He withholds the sustenance, all in accordance with His divine will and divine knowledge and wisdom. God has the names, the withholder, Al-Qabid, and the sustainer, Al-Razaq, names manifested in accordance with his divine will without contradictions, unlike fidelity and adultery, which are not manifestations of two different actions that are mutually exclusive, but the manifestation of two contradictory meanings. Do you understand that fallacy? There is a very clear fallacy in the question. Fidelity and adultery are contradictory, but the opposites of the names of Allah are mutually exclusive. A man who is married cannot have fidelity while being an adulterer, as fidelity implies that the absence of adultery. Yet a person can be generous to whomever he wants and stingy with whomever he wants. And there will be no contradiction between the two here. Of course, a person can be stingy. Allah is not stingy. But this is an example for a person, a human being. For God to manifest His most merciful nature to a specific creation is His will. And for Him to manifest His name as the Punisher, the one who harms to any one of His creation, is also His divine will. For a human to judge God on human standards reflects a deep flaw in thinking, as it is totally incommensurable to compare the all-knowing with those who have partial, contingent and limited knowledge, especially given that the one has no need of his creation, the one here with the capital O, while creatures need him and require one another for various motives.